creaked, strained to its limit against the jagged rock. High in the snowy peaks of the Appalachians, a 75-year-old woman named Martha stood her ground, her weathered hands raw and bleeding as she pulled with every ounce of her soul.
Below her, dangling over the abyss, was a fallen Navy SEAL, and beside her, a K9 dog named Boone, his teeth clamped onto the line, pulling for his master's life. I'm Wilder. I've lived in these woods for 30 years, and I know that sometimes survival requires a miracle only love can provide. This is a story of a soldier who lost his way and a dog that led him home, to the unlikeliest of saviors. It's a tale where instincts are rewritten by compassion, and fear finally transforms into belief. Before we witness this rescue, I want to know who, as sitting at this campfire with me. Where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you believe the bond between man and beast is sacred, subscribe to join our wild family. Let's begin.
The sky over the Appalachian Mountains didn't darken slowly. It bruised, a deep, sickly purple that bled into a blinding white.
The wind began as a low hum, a ghostly vibration through the ancient hemlocks, before it escalated into a deafening roar that stripped the heat from your skin in seconds.
In these woods, winter isn't just a season, it's a predator, patient and cold, waiting for the moment you lose your footing. The ridges, once majestic, became jagged teeth under a shroud of relentless frost, erasing the boundary between the earth and the sky. Jax Miller moved through this frozen labyrinth like a ghost haunted by his own shadow. At 34, Jax was a man built of iron and scar tissue. Standing 6'2", his frame was broad, honed by years of specialized warfare as a Navy SEAL. His face, once handsome in a rugged Boy Scout way, was now a map of quiet trauma. His jaw was permanently set in a hard line, and his eyes, a piercing icy blue, carried a 1,000-yard stare that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He wore a heavy tactical olive drab parka, salt-stained and worn, and his movements were disciplined, yet there was a heaviness in his stride that had nothing to do with the gear on his back. Jax wasn't hiking for leisure. He was a man trying to outrun memories that didn't need legs to follow him. By his side, matching his rhythmic pace, was Boone. Boone was a Belgian Malinois, a retired K9 veteran with the same silver-gray muzzle that Jax was starting to show at his temples. At 8 years old, Boone was lean and muscular, his coat a blend of mahogany and soot. One of his ears had a jagged notch from a piece of shrapnel in Kandahar, a permanent reminder of the bond he shared with the man beside him. Boone didn't just walk, he cleared the path, his amber eyes constantly scanning the tree line, his nose twitching against the freezing gale. He was the only soul on Earth Jax still trusted, a silent guardian who knew the sound of Jax's nightmares better than anyone. The storm hit with a sudden, violent fury. The whiteout was instantaneous, turning the world into a spinning marble of ice and grit. Jax squinted, his eyelashes freezing together. He reached out to grab Boone's harness, but the ground beneath his boots, a deceptive shelf of limestone covered in a thin, treacherous layer of black ice, suddenly vanished. It didn't feel like falling at first. It felt like the world had simply stopped supporting him. Jax tumbled backward, a silent cry caught in his throat as gravity claimed him. He struck a jagged outcrop halfway down, a sickening crack echoing through the canyon as his tibia snapped like a dry twig. He hit the bottom of the 15-meter ravine with a dull thud, the air driven from his lungs, his world spinning into a terrifying velvet darkness. When his eyes finally flickered open, the pain wasn't there yet. That was the most dangerous part. The cold had numbed his nerves, acting as a cruel anesthetic. He lay on his back, staring up at the narrow slit of the ravine's opening, where the snow was pouring down like ash from a volcano. He tried to move, but his left leg was twisted at an impossible angle, pinned beneath a fallen slab of granite. "Boone," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper against the howling wind above. As the hypothermia began to settle into his bones, the ravine walls started to dissolve. The white snow turned into the scorching yellow dust of a desert outskirts. The sound of the wind transformed into the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of rotor blades. Suddenly, he wasn't in the Appalachians anymore. He was back in the green zone, huddled behind a crumbling mud wall. He saw Sarah, a fellow operative, sharp-tongued and brilliant, the only person who could make him laugh in a war zone, barking orders into a radio. But the vision shifted to the man right in front of him, Caleb. Caleb was Jax's best friend, a kid from Ohio with a lopsided grin and a heart too big for the uniform he wore. In Jax's fever dream, Caleb was reaching out, his hand stained with oil and dirt. "Stay down, Jax. I've got the extraction point," Caleb yelled. Jax tried to scream, to tell him about the tripwire, but his throat was filled with sand. He watched for the 1,000th time as Caleb stepped forward to shield Jax from an incoming blast. The explosion was silent in the dream, a blinding flash of white that faded back into the falling snow of the ravine. Jax groaned, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the stone pinning his leg. "Why am I still here?" he thought, his eyelids drooping. Caleb stayed in the sand. Sarah moved on. "Maybe this is where I'm supposed to stay too." The darkness felt inviting. It felt like an end to the noise in his head. He stopped fighting. He let his head fall back into the powder, the cold beginning to feel strangely warm, like a blanket. He was ready to let the snow bury the broken soul that Jax Miller had become. But then, through the haze of death and memory, he heard it. A howl. Not the howl of a wolf, but a desperate, mournful cry of a partner who refused to accept a no-go mission. Boone was standing at the edge of the cliff above, his silhouette dark against the gray sky, his voice screaming into the storm, demanding that the world give his human back. The howl did not linger in the air. It was swallowed instantly by the voracious appetite of the gale, but the intent behind it remained etched in the frozen silence of Boone's soul.
On the jagged lip of the ravine, the Belgian Malinois stood like a bronze statue carved from the very mountain itself.
His mahogany fur was matted with ice, and his black mask was dusted with a fine layer of frost, making him look like a ghost of the Great Wars. He looked down into the darkness where Jax lay, a small, broken shadow against the white, and for a heartbeat, the dog's instinct told him to jump. He wanted to descend, to lie across his master's chest and offer his own body heat to keep the guttering candle of Jax's life from going out. But Boone was not just a dog, he was a K9, a veteran of the 75th Ranger Regiment's multi-purpose K9 unit. He knew that 2 frozen bodies in a hole meant certain death. He had to move. He had to find the extraction. With a final sharp yelp that was more a promise than a farewell, Boone turned his back on the ravine. The world outside was a swirling chaos of white needles. The Appalachian forest, usually a familiar playground of scents and trails, had transformed into a hostile, alien landscape. Boone began to run. His gait was uneven at first, his joints stiff from the sudden drop in temperature, but soon he found his rhythm, a steady, tireless lope that he had perfected over hundreds of miles of Middle Eastern sand and jagged mountain ridges. He was a creature of kinetic energy, his powerful haunches driving him forward through snow that reached his chest. Every leap was a battle against the thickening drifts, and every breath was a lung-burning draft of ice. However, the physical struggle was only half of the war Boone was fighting. As he pushed deeper into the pines, the storm began to speak in a language that terrified him. A massive branch, overburdened by the weight of the frost, snapped with a sound like a high-caliber rifle shot. Boone flinched violently, his paws sliding on the hidden ice. He crouched low, his tail tucked, his ears flattening against his skull. To any other dog, it was just a noise, but to Boone, it was a trigger. The sound sent him spiraling back to a dusty alleyway in Ramadi. He could almost smell the acrid scent of cordite and burning rubber. He remembered the flash of the IED that had notched his ear and shattered his nerves. Another roar of wind hit the hollow of a nearby tree, producing a deep, booming thud that mimicked the percussion of a mortar round. Boone whimpered, his body trembling so hard that he nearly collapsed in the snow. The ghost thunder of his past was screaming at him to hide, to find a dark hole and wait for the world to stop exploding. But then, a scent flickered across his olfactory receptors. Faint, ancient, and deeply rooted in Jax. It was the scent of the tactical wax Jax used on his boots, mixed with the lingering aroma of the cedarwood soap from their small cabin. It was the smell of home, and right now, home was dying in a ditch 5 miles back. Boone forced his head up. He let out a low, guttural growl, not at the storm, but at his own fear. He bared his teeth against the wind, defying the thunder of his memories. He pushed forward, his love for the man who had shared every ration tin and every cold night with him, acting as a shield against the trauma. He wasn't running from the explosions anymore. He was running toward a hope he couldn't yet see. 2 miles in, the forest changed. The scent of pine was replaced by something sharp and predatory. Boone slowed, his hackles rising in a stiff ridge along his spine. In the gray twilight of the storm, 3 shapes emerged from the shadows of the hemlocks. They were Appalachian timber wolves, gaunt, desperate, and gray-furred. The leader of the pack, a scarred male with a missing eye, and a coat that looked like tattered felt, stepped forward. This wolf was a survivor of a hard winter, driven by a hunger that outweighed the natural fear of man or dog. He saw Boone not as a fellow canine, but as a stray meal, weakened by the storm. The wolves began to circle, their movements fluid and ghostly in the whiteout. Boone didn't have time for a territorial dispute. He didn't have time to bleed. He let out a snarl that sounded less like a dog and more like a serrated blade. He didn't wait for them to close the circle. He lunged at the lead wolf, not to kill, but to dominate. He used his tactical training, striking with his shoulder to knock the lighter predator off balance before snapping his jaws inches from the wolf's throat. It was a display of sheer, military-grade aggression. The timber wolves, used to prey that ran, were startled by this mahogany demon that fought with the precision of a soldier. Boone didn't stay to finish the fight. As soon as the circle broke, he bolted, using a burst of speed that left the startled pack in his wake. He was a messenger, and he refused to be delayed. By the 4th mile, Boone's strength was flagging. His paws were bleeding, leaving small pink blossoms in the snow with every step. The cold was beginning to seize his muscles, and the ghost thunder continued to crash around him with every falling branch. He was stumbling now, his vision blurring as the frost began to coat his eyelashes. He was losing his way. He began to circle a large rock, his mind wandering into the gray haze of exhaustion. He wanted to lay down. He wanted to sleep. But just as his legs began to buckle, a prickle of something different hit his senses. It wasn't a sound, and it wasn't a smell of the forest. It was a golden flicker, a tiny, defiant pinprick of orange light dancing against the curtain of white. It was the glow of a hearth fire. Boone's ears pricked forward. He caught the scent of burning hickory and something sweet, like dried apples and old paper. It was the scent of humanity. With a final agonizing surge of will, he threw himself toward the light. He cleared a fallen log, crashed through a thicket of frozen briars, and skidded into a small, man-made clearing. There, nestled against the side of a granite slope, was a small log cabin. It was an old structure, the wood darkened by decades of weather, with a porch that groaned under the weight of the snow. A single window cast a warm, inviting amber glow onto the porch. Boone didn't hesitate. He didn't bark. He didn't have the breath left for it. He dragged his frozen body up the 3 wooden steps and collapsed against the heavy oak door. He used the last of his energy to lift his front paw and scratch, a rhythmic, desperate thudding against the wood. Thump, thump, thump. He was the messenger who had reached the end of his line, praying that whoever lived behind this door still believed in helping a stranger in the dark.
The interior of the Sterling cabin smelled of dried lavender, beeswax, and the lingering, comforting scent of hickory smoke.
It was a home frozen in a gentler decade, where every doily was hand-knitted and every floorboard whispered a name. Martha Sterling sat in her high-backed rocking chair, her small, frail-looking frame nearly swallowed by a heavy wool cardigan the color of oatmeal. At 75, Martha was a woman who resembled a winter bird, slender, with delicate bones, and a crown of soft white hair that glowed like halo in the lamplight. Her face was a gentle cartography of a life well lived. Deep lines of laughter sat beside the softer shadows of grief. Her eyes, a sharp and perceptive hazel, remained her most striking feature, holding the clarity of someone who had spent half a century watching the seasons turn from the same porch. Since her husband Elias had passed 3 years ago, the silence in the house had become a physical presence, a heavy velvet curtain that Martha found increasingly difficult to pull aside. On the small side table next to her sat a stack of brochures for the Gables Assisted Living Center, their glossy pages promising a life of scheduled bingo and lukewarm tea. Martha looked at them with a mixture of resignation and quiet resentment. She felt like an old clock that everyone had forgotten to wind. She was still ticking, but she no longer served a purpose in a world that moved too fast for her gait. She had been planning to call the realtor on Monday, convinced that she was no longer capable of holding back the encroaching wilderness. But as she reached out to dim the hurricane lamp, a sound broke the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the groaning of the timbers. It was a desperate, heavy thud against the oak door, followed by a frantic, rhythmic scratching that sounded like a plea for mercy. Martha froze, her hand hovering over the lamp. In these mountains, a knock at the door during a blizzard usually meant trouble or tragedy. She stood up, her knees popping with the familiar protest of age, and moved toward the hallway. She reached for the heavy iron bolt, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped moth. When the door swung open, the freezing wind rushed in, bringing a swirl of white crystals and a dark, shivering shape that collapsed across the threshold. Martha gasped, clutching her throat. It was a dog, but unlike any stray she had ever seen. Even matted with ice and bleeding from his paws, Boone's military bearing was evident. He wore a tattered tactical harness, and his amber eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, held a terrifyingly human intensity. He didn't bark, he simply looked at her, then turned his head back toward the darkness of the forest, letting out a low, mournful whine that vibrated through the floorboards. "Oh, you poor creature," Martha whispered, her fear instantly replaced by a deep-seated instinct to heal. She knelt on the cold floor, her hands trembling as she touched the dog's frozen fur. Boone didn't recoil. Instead, he nudged her hand with a cold nose and then pulled away, moving toward the door again. He looked at her, then at the storm, then back at her. The message was as clear as a shouted command. He is still out there. Come. Martha felt a sudden electric jolt of clarity. The uselessness she had felt all morning evaporated. This wasn't a stray. This was a messenger, and he had chosen her door out of all the miles of empty forest. She moved with a briskness she hadn't felt in years. She hurried to the mudroom, where Elias's old gear still hung like the relics of a forgotten saint. Elias Sterling had been a legendary forest ranger, a man who knew the Appalachian trails better than the back of his own hand. He had been a towering figure of bronze and grit, known for his unwavering calmness in a crisis. Martha stopped for a heartbeat in front of a framed photograph of him in his green uniform, his arm draped around a much younger, radiant Martha. "I'm not ready for the home yet, Elias," she muttered to the glass. "There's a soul out there who needs a Sterling." She began to pull on her heavy winter boots, her fingers fumbling with the laces in her haste. She donned a thick goose-down parka and wrapped a long wool scarf around her face until only her sharp hazel eyes were visible. From a heavy wooden chest, she hauled out a coil of high-grade climbing rope, Elias's lifeline. It was 50 feet of braided nylon, weathered but unbreakable. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and a thermos of hot broth. Outside, she went to the shed and fired up the old snowmobile. It was a vintage machine, a Ski-Doo from the late 80s, loud and temperamental, but Elias had maintained it with obsessive care. As the engine roared to life, spewing a cloud of blue smoke into the white night, Boone let out a sharp, encouraging bark. He leaped into the deep snow, his mahogany body disappearing and reappearing like a dolphin in a frozen sea, leading the way. The journey back into the storm was a descent into madness. Martha sat perched on the snowmobile, her knuckles white as she gripped the handlebars. The headlights cut a weak yellow path through the blinding squall, reflecting off the billion ice needles that threatened to blind her. She followed the dark shadow of Boone, who seemed to have found a second wind fueled by sheer desperation. They bypassed frozen creeks and skidded around the skeletal remains of fallen pines. Every time Martha felt the urge to turn back, every time her elderly muscles screamed in the biting cold, she looked at Boone. The dog would stop, turn his head to ensure she was still there, his eyes glowing like embers in the dark. For Martha, the forest no longer felt like an enemy trying to push her out. It felt like a stage where she was finally playing a vital role again. The brochures for the assisted living center felt like they belonged to another person's life. Out here, with the wind roaring in her ears and the smell of gasoline and pine needles filling her lungs, she was the guardian of the old forest. She was Martha Sterling, the ranger's wife, and she was on a mission of life and death. As they approached the area near the limestone ravine, the wind seemed to howl with a renewed ferocity, as if the mountain itself was trying to keep its prize. Boone slowed his pace, his nose to the ground, his ears flattened. He began to circle a specific point where the snow had drifted high against a shelf of rock. He stopped at the very edge of the precipice, his body rigid, and let out a howl that pierced through the thunder of the storm. Martha killed the engine. The silence that followed was terrifying. She crawled toward the edge, the heavy rope coiled over her shoulder, peering into the black throat of the ravine. Somewhere down there, a life was fading, and she was the only bridge left between that man and the world of the living. The edge of the ravine was a treacherous lip of ice and crumbling shale, a hungry mouth waiting to swallow anything that lost its purchase.
Martha Sterling knelt in the biting spindrift, her knees sinking deep into the powder as she peered into the abyss.
The beam of her heavy flashlight cut through the swirling white curtain, dancing over jagged frozen walls until it finally snagged on a patch of tactical olive drab. "I see him, Boone! I see him!" she cried out, her voice thin against the roar of the gale. Beside her, the Belgian Malinois was a fury of focused energy, his paws digging into the frozen earth, his eyes never leaving the dark shape 15 meters below. Jax lay broken at the bottom, his skin the color of ash, half buried under a fresh shroud of snow. He looked less like a man and more like a discarded relic of a war that wouldn't end. Martha knew that every second the freezing air filled his lungs, the closer his heart came to stopping. She turned her gaze to a massive, ancient white oak that stood like a silent sentinel just a few feet from the precipice. Its bark was gnarled and thick, the skin of a titan that had weathered a century of Appalachian winters. This tree was her anchor, her only ally, in a world that wanted Jax dead. With fingers that felt like stiff wooden pegs, Martha began the grueling task of securing the lifeline. She wrapped Elias's heavy climbing rope twice around the base of the white oak, tying a bowline knot with a muscle memory that bypassed her shivering mind. She had watched Elias do this 1,000 times during mountain rescues. She hadn't realized she had been learning the rhythm of survival all along. Once the anchor was set, she threw the coil into the darkness. The nylon hissed as it unspooled, disappearing into the whiteout. "Jackson!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Jackson, you grab that rope! Do you hear me? You aren't staying in that hole today." Below, in the numbing depths of the ravine, Jackson Miller felt the world return in a sudden, violent surge of agony. The cold had been a mercy, but as the rope struck his shoulder, the shock jarred him back to consciousness. His leg was a scream of white-hot fire, a jagged bone-deep protest that threatened to black him out again. He looked up, his vision blurred by frost and blood, and saw a flickering yellow light. It looked like a star that had fallen from the sky. Jax's hands, gloved in tattered tactical wool, shook uncontrollably as he reached for the line. Every movement was a battle against the stone pinning him down. He groaned, a guttural sound of pure exertion, as he looped the rope around his torso, beneath his armpits, fumbling with a clumsy knot that his SEAL training would have mocked, but his survival instinct demanded. I'm tied, he wheezed, the words barely escaping his blue lips. Up on the ridge, Martha felt the line go taut. The weight was immense. Jax was a broad-shouldered man of iron, and with his gear, he was far heavier than anything Martha's 75-year-old frame should have been able to move. But as she gripped the rope, something happened. The adrenaline of a mother protecting her young flooded her veins, a mountain woman's iron will overriding the frailty of age. She planted her boots against a protruding root of the oak, leaning her entire body weight back into the harness. "Now, Boone, pull!" Boone didn't need the command. The K9 leaped into action, grabbing a secondary loop of the rope in his powerful jaws. The dog's muscles bunched and rippled under his mahogany fur as he dug his claws into the ice, leaning forward with a low, primal growl. It was a rhythmic, agonizing slow-motion dance. Martha would heave, gaining a few inches of nylon, and Boone would hold the line, his neck straining, preventing Jax from slipping back. "Come on, Jax!" Martha shouted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Talk to me, son! Stay awake!" As she pulled, her mind went to Elias. She began to speak, her voice a steady, rhythmic chant to drown out the screaming of the wind. She told Jax about Elias Sterling, the man who once tracked a lost toddler through a 3-day storm just by the smell of crushed wintergreen. She described the way Elias looked when he came home from a long patrol, his uniform smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. "He was a stubborn man, Elias was," she grunted, the rope searing her palms even through her thick mittens. "He used to say the forest has a heart, but it don't have no pity. It'll take what you give it, but it won't give back what you fight for. And I'm fighting for you, Jackson Miller." Inch by grueling inch, the man rose from the grave. Jax gripped the rock wall with his good leg and his raw hands, assisting the pull from above. The pain in his leg was so intense he could smell it, a metallic tang at the back of his throat. He felt his spirit slipping, the darkness of the ravine whispering that it would be so much easier to just let go. But every time his eyes closed, Martha's voice pulled him back. Her stories of the old ranger, of the cabin with the warm hearth, of the life that still waited above the ice, acted like a winch for his soul. Finally, his fingers hooked over the frozen edge of the ridge. Martha let out a sob of relief and exertion. She dropped the rope and lunged forward, grabbing Jax's wrists with a grip that was surprisingly powerful. Her hands were small, gnarled like the roots of the oak, but they were radiating a heat that felt like a summer sun to Jax. As she pulled him over the final lip of the precipice, Jax collapsed into the snow, his breath coming in jagged heaves. Martha didn't let go. She pulled him toward her, cradling his head in her lap, as Boone circled them, licking the frost from Jax's face in a frantic display of relief. Jax looked up into Martha's hazel eyes, seeing the fierce maternal protection burning there. He reached out and grasped her hand, a small, bony hand that felt like it was made of warm marble. In that moment, the 1,000-yard stare flickered and died. He didn't see the desert. He didn't see Caleb's ghost. He saw a mother. He felt a connection that transcended the cold, a silent promise that he was no longer alone in his war. The forest. Martha whispered, leaning down so her scarf brushed his forehead. "The old woods don't allow you to give up, Jax, and neither do I. You're home now." Jax tried to speak, but the warmth of her presence was too much. For the first time in years, the tension in his chest uncoiled. He allowed himself to lean into her, a broken soldier finally finding a sanctuary in the arms of the mountain's guardian.
The world outside the log walls was a screaming void of white, but inside, Martha Sterling's kitchen, time seemed to slow down, thickening like the heavy cream in her stew pot. The air was a rich tapestry of scents, dried rosemary, simmering bone broth, and the sharp, medicinal tang of witch hazel and pine salve.
Jax lay on a makeshift daybed near the hearth, his legs splinted with sturdy cedar planks and wrapped in clean linen strips. The fierce heat from the stone fireplace pulsed against his skin, a stark contrast to the deathly chill of the ravine. Martha moved around the space with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime mending what the world tried to break. She wasn't just a cook or a homeowner, she was a keeper of old knowledge. As she ground dried comfrey root in a stone mortar, she looked like an alchemist, her small hands moving with a grace that defied her 75 years. "Drink this, Jackson," she commanded softly, handing him a mug of steaming willow bark tea, a natural remedy for the fever that had begun to take hold of him. Jax took the mug, his fingers still stiff, and looked at her. For the first time since he had returned from overseas, the hypervigilance in his chest felt like it was being dampened by the domestic peace of the cabin. He watched Martha as she tended to her other companion, a one-eared ginger tabby cat named Barnaby. Barnaby was an old Tom, likely 12 or 13 years old, with a notched ear and a slow, rhythmic purr that sounded like a distant engine. He was a survivor of the woods, much like Jax, and he sat perched on the windowsill, his yellow eyes watching the storm, with a bored indifference that Jax found strangely comforting. As the days blurred together under the relentless siege of the blizzard, the silence between them began to fill with stories. Jax, a man who had built a fortress around his heart, found the walls crumbling under Martha's unpretentious kindness. One evening, as the firelight danced across the ceiling, he told her about the sand and the smoke. He spoke of Caleb, the kid from Ohio, who should have gone home to his mother, and the tripwire that Jax hadn't seen in time. He confessed the weight of the survivor's guilt that had been drowning him, the belief that he was a broken machine, no longer fit for the world of the living. Martha listened without judgment, her knitting needles clicking a steady, comforting rhythm. "You aren't broken, Jax," she said, her hazel eyes reflecting the embers. "You're just seasoned, like old cast iron. It takes a lot of fire to make something that lasts." She told him that grief was just love, with no place to go, and that Elias had always said the hardest wounds to heal weren't the ones that bled. Jax felt a knot in his soul begin to loosen. In this kitchen, surrounded by an old woman's wisdom and a one-eared cat's calm, the ghost thunder of the war felt further away than it ever had in the city. Meanwhile, Boone had taken up a silent, solemn vigil at the heavy oak door. The K-9 veteran had found his own peace in the cabin, but his training never truly slept. While Jax healed on the inside, Boone became the guardian of the threshold. He refused to sleep on the soft rug Martha had offered him, choosing instead to lie across the cold draft at the bottom of the door, his ears constantly swiveling. Outside, the storm had driven the mountain's inhabitants to desperation. On the third night, a shadow larger than the wind detached itself from the pines. A massive black bear, a sow likely 500 pounds and driven by the frantic hunger of a long winter, climbed onto the porch. She was a ragged, formidable creature, her fur matted with ice, her nostrils flared as she caught the scent of the stew simmering inside. She began to huff, a deep guttural sound that vibrated through the logs, and her heavy claws scraped against the wood of the door. Barnaby the cat puffed up his fur and hissed from the windowsill, but Boone was already on his feet. The dog didn't bark. He knew Jax needed rest. Instead, he let out a low, vibrating snarl that started in the soles of his paws and ended in a display of white teeth. He pressed his weight against the door, his mahogany body a solid barrier. Through the wood, the bear and the dog engaged in a silent war of wills. Boone's hackles were a rigid ridge of iron, his amber eyes glowing with a protective fury. He wasn't the scared dog who flinched at branches anymore. He was a K-9 on mission. The bear, sensing a predator behind the wood that didn't know how to retreat, eventually huffed one last time and lumbered back into the whiteout. Boone didn't relax until the scent of the beast vanished. He returned to his spot, but his tail gave a single satisfied thump against the floor. The peace of the kitchen hadn't made him soft. It had given him something to fight for besides survival. He realized that his trauma was a scar, not a weakness. And as he watched Jax sleep, The dog finally allowed himself to close his eyes, lulled by the warmth of the hearth and the healing spirit of the house. The transition from winter to spring in the Appalachian Mountains was not a sudden event, but a slow, melodic awakening.
The violent whiteouts that had once threatened to bury Jackson Miller's soul were replaced by the rhythmic dripping of melting icicles and the scent of damp earth rising from beneath the retreating frost.
Green shoots of wild ramps and trillium began to pierce through the leaf litter, and the air, once sharp enough to cut the lungs, now carried the sweet, heady promise of pine resin and mountain laurel. For Jax, the physical healing had mirrored the season. His leg, once shattered and pinned by stone, was now strong again, though he walked with a slight, rhythmic hitch, a permanent reminder of the ravine that he wore not with shame, but with a quiet sense of survival. As the snow disappeared, so did the 1,000-yard stare. His icy blue eyes had softened, reflecting the clear spring sky rather than the gray ash of war. He spent his mornings on Martha's porch, the heavy tactical parka replaced by a simple flannel shirt, working wood with a chisel instead of a rifle. He had made a choice that no commanding officer could have ordered. He wasn't going back to the concrete canyons of the city. He used his military disability back pay and savings to purchase the overgrown 20-acre lot adjacent to Martha's property, but he didn't build a fortress. Instead, he spent his days repairing Martha's roof, reinforcing her porch, and clearing the brush that had threatened to swallow her home. He had become the silent sentinel of the hollow, a man who had found a mission that didn't require a uniform. Martha Sterling, too, had transformed. The brochures for the Gables Assisted Living Center had long since been used as kindling for the kitchen stove. She moved with a renewed vigor, her winter bird fragility replaced by the steady, grounded energy of a woman who knew she was needed. She was no longer just a widow waiting for the clock to run out. She was the matriarch of an unlikely tribe. She spent her afternoons teaching Jax how to identify medicinal ramps and how to boil down maple sap, her laughter echoing through the trees, a sound that Barnaby the ginger cat appreciated from his sunny spot on the newly repaired porch railing. Barnaby had accepted Jax and Boone into his territory with a flick of his notched ear, often curling up near Jax's boots as he worked, a silent endorsement from the mountain's oldest resident. Boone, the mahogany Malinois, was the bridge between them all. He had traded his tactical harness for a simple leather collar, though he still patrolled the perimeter with the precision of a K9 on watch. The ghost thunder no longer made him flinch. When the spring storms rolled in with actual thunder, Boone simply moved closer to Martha's rocking chair, resting his large head on her knee, finding sanctuary in her calm presence just as Jax had. The peace of the hollow was briefly interrupted in late April by the arrival of a sleek, silver SUV that looked entirely out of place against the mud-spattered backdrop of the spring thaw. Out stepped Owen Sterling, Martha's only nephew and her closest living relative. Owen was a man in his early 40s, dressed in a crisp navy soft-shell jacket and expensive hiking boots that had clearly never seen a trail. He was a corporate attorney from Charlotte, a man whose life was measured in billable hours and property values. His face was clean-shaven and handsome, but his eyes were restless, constantly checking his watch as if the mountains were a delay he couldn't afford. Owen had arrived with a briefcase full of paperwork and a mindset on liquidation. He hadn't visited Martha in years, and in his mind, his aunt was a liability, a frail old woman living in a dangerous, devaluating shack that needed to be sold before it collapsed. He walked up the porch steps with a practiced, sympathetic smile, ready to explain why the senior living transition was the only logical choice. However, the man he encountered was not the helpless widow he remembered. Martha stood on the porch, a hammer in her hand and a sharp hazel fire in her eyes. Beside her stood Jax, a towering wall of muscle and quiet intensity, and Boone, who let out a low, warning rumble that stayed Owen's feet. "Aunt Martha," Owen began, his voice smooth and persuasive, "I've already spoken to a developer about the timber rights and the acreage. We can get you a very comfortable suite in the city, close to the medical center. This place, it's just too much for you." Owen looked at Jax, his legal mind trying to categorize this stranger. "And who is this? A hired hand?" Martha stepped forward, her small frame radiating a newfound authority. "This is Jackson, Owen, he's family, and this shack is a home again." She told Owen about the Bazard, the Ravine, and the dog that had run 5 miles through a whiteout to save a life. She spoke of the courage it took to stay when everyone else was leaving. Owen looked at the repaired timbers, the sturdy new roof, and the way Jax and Boone moved in sync with his aunt's needs. He looked at the scarred hands of the soldier and the raw, honest gratitude in Martha's expression. For the first time in his career, Owen's logical arguments felt hollow. He realized that he had been trying to sell a memory he never bothered to cherish, while a stranger had stepped in to protect it with his life. He didn't open the briefcase. Instead, he stayed for dinner, a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, and listened to the stories of the winter. When he left the next morning, he didn't leave a contract. He left a promise to return for the harvest, finally understanding that some assets can't be measured in dollars. As the sun began to set on a warm May evening, the hollow was bathed in a soft golden light that turned the new leaves into shimmering emeralds. The day's work was done. Jack sat on the top step of the porch, his back against a sturdy post he had carved himself. Martha sat in her rocking chair behind him, the rhythmic creak thump of the wood against the floorboards providing a peaceful soundtrack to the evening. Boone lay between them, his chin resting on Jax's boot, his eyes half closed in total contentment. Barnaby sat on the railing, his tail twitching occasionally as he watched a distant hawk circle the ridge. There was no noise of the city, no screams of a distant war, only the deep, resonant pulse of the Appalachian forest. Jax looked out at the mountains, the jagged peaks that had almost been his headstone, and felt a profound sense of belonging. He wasn't a broken soul anymore. He was a protector, a son, and a friend. He reached back and patted Martha's hand, her gnarled fingers closing over his with a strength that still surprised him. "The forest didn't let us go, did it, Martha?" he asked quietly. Martha smiled, watching the orange sun dip behind the purple ridges. "No, Jax. It just waited for us to find each other." They sat there together, 3 survivors and a mountain cat. A family not bound by blood or birth, but by the shared fire of a winter storm and the unbreakable threads of a K9's loyalty. The happy ending wasn't a destination. It was the quiet, golden peace of a porch at sunset, where fear had finally, truly become belief.
This story of Jax, Martha, and Boone reminds us that the wilderness we fear most isn't always the one made of snow and stone. Sometimes, it's the quiet, cold isolation we carry within our own hearts. But as we've seen, even the deepest ravine cannot hold back a soul that is being called home by love and loyalty.
In our everyday lives, we often encounter people who are fighting silent wars, standing on the edge of their own personal cliffs. We might feel small like Martha, or broken like Jax, or unheard like Boone. But this tale teaches us that no act of kindness is ever wasted. A simple decision to stop, to listen, or to offer a hand can be the rope that pulls someone back from the brink. You don't need a uniform or a title to be a hero. You just need the courage to care when it would be easier to walk away. If this story touched your spirit today, please share it with someone who might be feeling lost in their own storm. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. If you believe that compassion and faith can move mountains, please subscribe to our channel and join our family of storytellers.
May God bless your home, watch over your journeys, and send the right companions to walk beside you when the path gets steep. If you feel the warmth of this message in your heart, please leave an amen in the comments to honor the spirit of this journey. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are never truly alone.